Hey everyone, Dr. D here, and in this video we are going to be covering Chapter 3 from our Biology 12th edition by Campbell textbook. This chapter covers water and life, so let's go ahead and get started.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Explain stuff.
All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 3. This chapter is interesting. It covers water and water's importance in life. So, one thing to know about water molecules, as we learned in Chapter 2, remember this. Remember that a water molecule is polar. Remember that the hydrogen atoms on the water molecule are slightly positively charged or partially positively charged, and the oxygen, it has a partial negative charge. Do you guys remember that from chapter 2? And the reason for this is because water is a polar molecule. Oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen. So when there's a covalent bond between oxygen and hydrogen, oxygen ends up kind of pulling those electrons a little closer to it, giving the oxygen a partial negative charge. Remember that electrons have a negative charge, and if the negatively charged electrons are kind of being pulled towards the oxygen, then the oxygen develops a partial negative charge, leaving the hydrogens with a partial positive charge because they're just left with their proton without an electron nearby to keep it neutral. And remember that water molecules, we talked in chapter 2, how water molecules can interact with other water molecules. Do you remember that? The partially negatively charged oxygen of one water molecule will lightly stick to the partially positively charged hydrogen on the next water molecule. And remember, there's a little bit of stickiness because opposites attract. Well, what do these little dots represent? Remember, when you draw a series of tiny dots, that represents a hydrogen bond. So this here is called a hydrogen bond. Water molecules can hydrogen bond with other water molecules. So hopefully this is all a review of what we learned in the previous chapter. And do you remember what that's called when water molecules stick to one another via hydrogen bonding? Yeah, that's called cohesion. Remember that? Cohesion. Now, this, believe it or not, explains how ice floats on water. Do you guys know how ice floats on top of water? This means that the solid state of H2O, which is ice, is less dense than the liquid form of H2O. So let's look at why that is. If we look at liquid H2O on the left, you'll see that these water molecules are kind of bumping into each other, slipping by each other. See, it says right here that the water molecules can slip close together. So they're slipping. They're trying to make these hydrogen bonds, which are denoted here by the series of dots. They're trying to form hydrogen bonds with one another, but they're moving so fast that these hydrogen bonds make and break and make and break, and these water molecules actually get quite close to each other. However, when water freezes, look at this on the right. When water freezes, these water molecules stop moving so quickly. They slow down, slow down. And when they slow down and freeze, and they, for the most part, stop moving, they're able to make all the hydrogen bonds they want to make. See, before they were moving around so fast, they couldn't make all these hydrogen bonds. They tried, but it's almost like a little mosh pit going on in here, right? And so these little water molecules are way too close together. However, look on the right again. When the water molecules stop moving, they're able to make all the hydrogen bonds with one another that they want to, and this spreads them out a little bit. Look how they're spread out here. There are fewer water molecules in the same area, and that is the definition of density, right? It's the number of molecules in a particular volume, right? So the density decreases when water freezes because the water molecules spread out and form all these nice hydrogen bonds with one another, spreading themselves out. And this is why ice is less dense than water, and why ice floats on top of the ocean, for instance. So you can see here a seal enjoying the ice water. Again, when this is important for life on Earth, because when water freezes, let's say the ice caps, North Pole, South Pole, we have a lot of ice, right, on the ocean. The ocean freezes at the surface, and underneath the ice, the ice at the surface of the ocean, there's liquid water for the animals to live, the fish, the seals, the other creatures to live inside of the water. If ice was more dense than water, then when ice formed, then the ice would sink to the bottom of the ocean, and before you knew it, the whole ocean would freeze over, right? So the fact that ice floats makes life possible, especially at the poles. Isn't that interesting? And now you know why ice is less dense than liquid water. It's because of these hydrogen bonding between water molecules. So it forms this crystal lattice, and this crystal is the ice crystal where the water molecules spread out. Isn't that interesting? Now remember, water is polar, and the reason why water molecules are polar is because of the polar covalent bonds between the oxygen and the two hydrogens inside of the water molecule. Oxygen is more electronegative and hydrogen is less electronegative. That's why the oxygen hogs those electrons. The oxygen draws those electrons close, and because the electrons have a negative charge, the oxygen develops a partial negative charge. Okay, and again, this is why water is a polar molecule. And because water is polar, meaning it has a partial positive end and a partial negative end, because of that, this allows the water molecules to stick to one another, because the partially positively charged hydrogen of one water molecule will stick to the partially negatively charged oxygen on the next water molecule. And that's what's responsible for water sticking to itself and forming hydrogen bonds with itself. Remember, and that's called cohesion, when water molecules stick to one another. Here you can see what I've been talking about. Here are 5 individual water molecules sticking together with hydrogen bonds. See, there's a water molecule in the middle. Let's see how it's sticking to these adjacent water molecules. Look at this water molecule at the top. Notice how it's the partially negatively charged oxygen of this top water molecule that's interacting with the partially positively charged hydrogen in this middle water molecule. You see that? Opposites attract, right? So the partially negatively charged oxygen likes to weakly stick to the partially positively charged hydrogen. And this is known as a weak bond, and specifically a hydrogen bond. A hydrogen bond is a very weak bond that can make and break very easily. And again, if this is a partially positively charged hydrogen, it would want to stick to this water molecule's partially negatively charged oxygen with another hydrogen bond. Anytime you see a series of dots, that's a hydrogen bond. Here's a hydrogen bond. Here's a hydrogen bond. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think 2 water molecules would want to interact with their hydrogens? So, for example, do you think this water molecule would want its hydrogen to interact with the hydrogen on this water molecule? Well, the answer would be no, not really, because like charges repel, right? So the hydrogen of one water would not want to stick to the hydrogen on another water molecule. You know why? Because a partially positive hydrogen would be coming close to a partially positive hydrogen. And, like charges just don't attract on the molecular scale, right? So you're always going to have the oxygen of one water molecule wanting to stick with a hydrogen bond to the hydrogen on the next. And notice that all of these interactions in this picture here are an oxygen of one water molecule sticking to the hydrogen on the next water molecule. And this is what's responsible for cohesion. Okay, and there are 4 properties of water that we need to understand that are important for life. 1, we talked about cohesion, right? Cohesive behavior of water. 2, the ability to moderate temperature. Water has an amazing ability to moderate temperature. 3, water expands upon freezing. We touched on this, right? When water freezes into ice, those water molecules spread out and they form a crystal. And when they spread out, this means that the crystal, the ice, is less dense than liquid water. And water, as we mentioned in chapter 2, is very versatile as a solvent. Remember, solvents are substances that dissolve things. So many different things dissolve in water. We can dissolve salt in water. We can dissolve sugar in water. We can dissolve many things in water. But there's also some things we can't dissolve in water, and we'll touch on that in a bit. So again, do you guys remember what cohesion means? Cohesion, the hydrogen bonding of water molecules to one another. These water molecules lightly stick to one another. And this cohesion results in a high surface tension. You know, at the surface of water, like on the surface of your swimming pool, you ever did a belly flop into your swimming pool? It hurts, right? Well, that's because water has surface tension. These hydrogen bonds that water makes are actually, they add up, and it can hold itself together. Water can hold itself together to some extent. And when you belly flop, you try to break a lot of these hydrogen bonds all at once. So surface tension is a measure of how difficult it is to stretch or break the surface of a liquid. So take a look at this strider here. This is like a spider who can run on top of the water. And as long as this spider is quick and light enough and quick enough, it's able to walk across the surface of the water. And why is that? Well, because water has cohesion at the surface, a term called surface tension. This is also why it hurts so bad to belly flop, but not so bad to dive properly. If you dive properly, you have fewer hydrogen bonds to break. If you belly flop, you have more hydrogen bonds to break. And so this is known as surface tension. And cohesion is responsible for surface tension. Okay. And cohesion's also very important for how plants get water. You know how you have to water your trees and water your plants? Well, this cohesion allows the plant to draw water up from the soil through its roots, through its trunk, out to the leaves. And I'm going to show you how this works in a minute. It also has to do with another term, adhesion. What is adhesion? Well, if cohesion is water molecules sticking to one another, adhesion is the attraction of water molecules to different substances. So, water molecules sticking to plant cell walls, for instance. So if water sticks to something else, this is adhesion. If water sticks to itself, this is cohesion. And this adhesion helps to counter the downward pull of gravity when water is crawling up the inside of a tree, when water is moving throughout the plant or tree. So let me show you how it works. Water is in the soil, right? When you water your plant, the soil is moist. The water gets drawn up into the roots, and the plant wants to draw the water up the trunk all the way up to the leaves or branches to the leaves. Now, what's responsible for drawing the water up the tree? Well, there are these water conducting cells inside of the plant, and it's actually a combination of cohesion and adhesion that allows the water to make its way up the tree. Adhesion being water's stickiness to the cell walls of plant, cohesion being water's stickiness to itself with hydrogen bonding. And the reason why this works is because at the leaves, the water is evaporating. Water evaporates from the leaves. That leaves an empty spot for more water to pull upwards, right? So think about the leaves are evaporating the water, and as that evaporation happens, more water is drawn up the tree via cohesion and adhesion. Isn't that neat? So understanding cohesion and adhesion allows you to understand how water makes its way up a tree. Now, here's another important aspect of water, and it's in its ability to moderate temperature. Water can absorb heat from warmer air and release that heat to cooler air. So it's a great buffer of heat. Water can absorb or release a large amount of heat with only a slight change to its own temperature. This is another important property of water. Now, just to define a couple terms here, because we're talking about heat, I just want to define some terms so that you can understand what heat really is and what heat has to do with water. So first of all, the first term I need to explain is kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion. The kinetic energy associated with the random motion of atoms or molecules is called thermal energy. So when we're talking about heat, when we're talking about thermal energy, this is kinetic energy at the molecular level. Molecules moving around fast is perceived as hot, as heat. That is what heat is. Heat is molecules moving quickly. When molecules slow and stop moving, this is where they freeze, right? This is where a substance becomes a solid and freezes. And that's more associated with cool, right? With cold. When the molecules are moving quickly, they have a lot of thermal energy. When they are not moving quickly, they have less thermal energy. I hope that makes sense. And temperature represents the average kinetic energy of the molecules in a body of matter. Again, the faster those molecules are moving, the more kinetic energy they have, the more the temperature is high. Okay, and conversely, if molecules are moving more slowly, then the temperature would be low. Thermal energy in transfer from one body of matter to another is defined as heat. So this is what we mean by the term heat. More terminology for you that's important to understand when we're talking about water. A calorie, or cal, is the amount of heat that's required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree. So when we say calorie, we mean how much heat is required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. It is also the amount of heat released when 1 gram of water cools by 1 degree Celsius. So if you're going to increase 1 gram of water by 1 degree, You have to introduce a calorie of energy to do that. If you allow the gram of water to cool, then the water will release 1 calorie of energy as it does so. The calories on food packages, on the other hand, are actually technically kilocalories. So a kilocalorie means 1,000 calories. So if you drink, something that has a calorie in it, and the bottle says, it has 1 calorie, it actually has 1,000 calories, because on the food packaging, a calorie is technically a kilocalorie. And what's a joule? A joule, or capital J, is another unit of energy. 1 joule is approximately a third of a calorie. It's 0.239 of a calorie. Now, here is an important term to understand. It's the term specific heat. This refers to the amount of heat that must be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of that substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. Water has a peculiarly high specific heat. Water's specific heat is 1 calorie per gram times degrees Celsius. Remember that it takes 1 calorie of energy to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree C. Well, that's a peculiarly high amount of energy. That's a high specific heat. So water resists changing its temperature because of its high specific heat. And this is an interesting property of water. And it lies in water's hydrogen bonds. The reason for this is because when water absorbs that heat, some of its hydrogen bonds break between the different water molecules. And when hydrogen bonds form, this results in heat being released. So water is high in its specific heat because of these hydrogen bonds absorbing heat to break the hydrogen bonds and releasing heat when they form hydrogen bonds. And the specific heat of water minimizes temperature fluctuations to within limits that permit life. So part of the reason why life can exist is the water on the earth and how it can buffer that heat for us. In fact, a large body of water can absorb and store a huge amount of heat from the sun in the daytime, so it cools the surrounding areas. And then at night, it can release that energy. It can release that warm air. This serves to moderate air temperature in coastal areas. Have you ever wondered why coastal areas are so nice? Like if you live on the beach, the weather just seems perfect all the time. Here's why. Again, look at the coastline of Southern California. You can see that on a hot day in California, the temperature on the coastline is low 70s, high 60s, beautiful weather, right? T-shirt and shorts weather. However, when you go more inland, away from the ocean, away from the water, notice that, you've got San Bernardino area at 100 degrees, Palm Springs at 106, right? So what's happening here? Why is the coast so much more just nice and why does it have such cool temperatures compared to inland? Well, again, when that heat from the sun radiates down, a lot of that heat is captured in the hydrogen bonds by breaking the hydrogen bonds of the water in the ocean. So it's almost like the ocean serves as a heat sink, cooling the surrounding environment, cooling the coastline for people that enjoy the coastline by a few degrees. And then at night, when it gets cold, the ocean will release that heat and prevent the coastline from becoming too cool. Or property of water is known as heat of vaporization. So evaporation or vaporization is the transformation of a substance from a liquid to a gas. And the heat of vaporization is the heat a liquid must absorb for 1 gram to be converted to gas. As a liquid evaporates, its remaining surface cools. This process is known as evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling of water helps stabilize temperatures in organisms and bodies of water. So this concept of evaporative cooling is very neat. It's the reason why sweating cools you down. So see what's happening here. This elephant is, trying to cool itself down by splashing water on its head. The water molecules with the greatest kinetic energy, the water molecules that are moving around the fastest, that are holding the most heat, they are the ones that leave as gas. They vaporize, they evaporate, making the remaining liquid water cooler. So when you sweat, let's say you're going outside to do some yard work and you start sweating, the reason the sweat seems to cool you down isn't because sweat makes you wet. It's because once you sweat, that sweat evaporates off of your body. And as it does, it takes a phenomenal amount of heat away from your skin. Isn't that neat? So when that water is evaporating, that's what transfers the heat off of your body and into the environment. And so when it's a humid day, the reason why they say humidity is so bad is because when it's a humid day, it's harder for your sweat to evaporate. And when your sweat can't evaporate, you're not going to get that relief of evaporative cooling. Isn't that interesting? This is why sometimes a dry heat is pretty tolerable, but a moist heat like a humid day is not. Now remember what we said earlier, that ice floats on liquid water? And that's because water is less dense as a solid than a liquid. And you remember why? It's because when the water molecules solidify, they form hydrogen bonds with all the close by water molecules, and that spreads them out. And at 0 degrees, water molecules are locked into a crystalline lattice. Remember that crystal shape they form when they all spread out nicely? The hydrogen bonds keep the molecules far enough apart to make the ice about 10% less dense than liquid water. So ice is about 10% less dense than liquid water. The molecules have moved apart that much. Water reaches its greatest density at around 4 degrees Celsius. And remember what I mentioned at the beginning? If ice did sink, that would be tragic for life on Earth, because all bodies of water would eventually freeze solid, making life impossible on Earth. So we can thank the fact that that ice floats to allow life on Earth, to allow organisms to continue living in the ocean with ice above, right? The ice is only at the surface of the oceans. However, many scientists are worried, especially in recent years, about global warming having a profound effect on icy environments around the globe. The rate at which glaciers and Arctic sea ice are disappearing poses an extreme challenge to animals that depend on the ice for their survival. So here you can see the effects of climate change on the Arctic. And you can see that the ice sheets spanned this pink border back in 1981 through 2010. the ice sheets extended to this pink border. But now, fast forward to 2019, and you can see how much the ice sheets have retreated. And this has had a profound effect on animals that live there. Some are benefited, but most are harmed by this loss of ice. And remember that water is a good solvent. A solvent is the dissolving agent of a solution. And solvents are good at dissolving solutes. The solute is the substance that is dissolved. So for example, if I were to dissolve salt into water, the solute is the salt and the water is the solvent. And that would form a solution, right? A solution is a liquid that is completely homogeneous mixture of substances. So for example, if I mix salt into water and I let it dissolve completely, I would have a saltwater solution. Now, an aqueous solution is one in which water is the solvent. And you should know that life is an aqueous environment. The cell is full of water, and that is known as an aqueous environment. Here you can see the table salt dissolving in water. Table salt is a compound of sodium chloride, and you can see that water can form hydration shells. That means that they can engulf. Water can stick to and surround and form hydration shells around the chloride anion as well as the sodium cation, and bringing it into solution. Notice too, if you look really closely, something neat. It is the partially positively charged hydrogen of the water molecules that sticks to the negatively charged chloride anion. However, it's the partially negatively charged oxygen of the water molecules that sticks to the positively charged sodium cation. Isn't that neat? That's how water would dissolve salt. Water can stick to salt, therefore water can dissolve salt. Water is a versatile solvent due to its polarity. When an ionic compound is dissolved in water, so for example, that salt was an ionic compound, right, of Na plus, and Cl minus is an ionic compound of table salt. When an ionic compound is dissolved in water, each ion is surrounded by a sphere of water molecules. Remember, and I called that a hydration shell. This is a hydration shell around chloride. This is a hydration shell around sodium. And this is how water brings things into solution. So when something is dissolved in water, that means that something has formed a hydration shell around it. And water can also dissolve compounds made up of non-ionic polar molecules. Polar molecules can also be dissolved in water. Even large polar molecules such as proteins can be dissolved in water. And that's if they have ionic and polar regions. So look at this big purple blob, okay? This big purple structure is a protein. It represents a protein. And as long as that protein has charges on its surface, like ionic charges on its surface or polar charges on its surface, well, guess what? Water can stick to it. Water will stick to those polar or ionic parts of the protein. Remember, the partially positively charged hydrogens of the water molecule will stick to any partially negatively charged bits on the protein, while the partially negatively charged portion of a water molecule will stick to any partially positive parts of the protein, and that will form a hydration shell around the protein and bring that protein into solution. Now, there are some really important terms that you should understand when it comes to water and substances that interact with water. A hydrophilic substance is a substance that has affinity for water. So hydrophilic substances would be anything with a charge on it. Remember, charges, you can have partial charges, right? Like a water molecule has a partial negative charge and a partial positive charge. Or you could have full-on charges like sodium cation or chloride anion. So ions have charges, polar molecules have charges. So those polar molecules and ionic substances are hydrophilic. So if that's true, what kind of substances are hydrophobic? This means a substance that does not have an affinity for water, cannot stick to water. Well, these hydrophobic substances would be nonpolar substances. Remember in chapter 2, we touched on methane. Methane is a nonpolar substance. Methane would be hydrophobic and it would not stick to water. Oil molecules are hydrophobic because they have relatively nonpolar bonds. Hydrophobic molecules related to oils are the major ingredients of cell membranes. So now let me hop to the board and I want to show you exactly why polar molecules and ionic substances dissolve in water and they are hydrophilic, and why fats, oils, waxes, and greases, and why methane is hydrophobic, meaning it will not mix with water and it will not be dissolved by water. So let's go explore. All right, pay close attention and you will understand exactly why water serves as such a good solvent and why water cannot dissolve certain substances like fats and oils. So let's get started. Remember that water is an oxygen with 2 hydrogens attached. And remember from chapter 2 that these covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen are actually polar covalent bonds, meaning the oxygen is more electronegative than the hydrogens. And so the oxygen is drawing those shared electrons closer. And because of that, the oxygen forms a partial negative charge, leaving the hydrogens with a partial positive charge. This means that water is a polar molecule. It has a partial negative end, it has partial positive end, and so this gives it certain properties. Now, remember, water molecules can stick to other water molecules. This is known as cohesion. But also, water molecules can stick to any other polar molecules as well. So do you remember this molecule that we talked about last time as well? This is NH3. This is known as ammonia. And ammonia is also a polar molecule. The nitrogen is more electronegative than the hydrogens. So the nitrogen sucks those electrons closer to it, leaving the nitrogen with a partial negative charge. And the hydrogens are left with what, do you think? That's right, a partial positive charge. So is ammonia a polar molecule or a non-polar molecule? It's obviously polar, right? Ammonia is a polar molecule. Just like water is a polar molecule, this is because of the polar covalent bonds due to the uneven sharing of electrons in those covalent bonds. Now, what do you think would happen? Do you remember when I said earlier that on the molecular scale that opposites attract? So positive charges attract negative charges, but like charges repel. Okay, so what do you think happens if a water molecule encounters ammonia? Do you think the slightly positively charged hydrogen on water would stick to the slightly negatively charged nitrogen on ammonia? Yeah, they're oppositely charged, right? A partial positive on the hydrogen of water, a partial negative on the nitrogen from ammonia, and we're gonna have a little bit of stickiness. And what did these dots represent? Do you remember what those dots represented? That's right. Hydrogen bonds. A hydrogen bond forms. See? A hydrogen bond forms between ammonia and water. So water's hydrogen will hydrogen bond with ammonia's nitrogen. Now let me ask you this. If there was a water molecule down here, could that water molecule interact with the ammonia? Well, not its hydrogens, right? Would the hydrogen of this water molecule interact with the hydrogen of that ammonia? No, right? Because like charges repel. So the water would flip around. This water would flip around. And this is what would happen. Look. The partially negatively charged oxygen of this water molecule would lightly stick to this hydrogen on the ammonia with what? What do these dots represent? That's right, a hydrogen bond. That's another hydrogen bond. Anytime you see a series of dots like that, that's a weak bond, a weak hydrogen bond. Now let me ask you this. Does ammonia dissolve in water? Yes, in fact, that's what a lot of window cleaners are, right? Like Windex and such. Ammonia does dissolve in water. And that is why, believe it or not, you guys, that's why water can dissolve ammonia. Ammonia dissolves in water because water can stick to it and form hydrogen bonds. And water molecules can surround the ammonia, forming the hydration shell around ammonia. And that's what brings the ammonia into solution to make a solution. Isn't that neat? So if water can form bonds with a molecule, like a polar molecule such as ammonia, water can dissolve ammonia. In fact, water can dissolve any molecules that are polar, right? That are polar, okay? Isn't that neat? So if water can stick to a molecule, water can dissolve that molecule. Isn't that neat? Now let me ask you this. What do you think would happen if water encountered sodium cation, right? Sodium cation. Could water stick to sodium cation? Yes. Now, do you think the partially positively charged hydrogen of water would stick to sodium cation? No, because they're like charges, right? But what if there was what if the oxygen of a water molecule, what if the oxygen, which is partially negatively charged, what if that oxygen were to come close to the sodium cation? Well, yes, they would interact, right? They would form a weak association. Isn't that neat? So knowing that, do you think that sodium cation would dissolve in water? Remember, as long as water can interact, can bond, because you have some kind of charge, the water can dissolve that substance, right? So yes, water can dissolve sodium cation because the oxygens from the water molecules would form hydrogen bonds with the sodium cation. Isn't that neat? And lastly, what do you think of this? Chloride anion. Remember sodium chloride, right? Chloride anion. Could water interact with chloride? Yes. And what part, let me ask you this. What part of the water molecule would form weak bonds, weak hydrogen bonds with chloride? That's right. The opposites attract, right? So it would be the partially positively charged hydrogen. It would be the partially positively charged hydrogen of the water molecule that would stick to chloride. So hydrogens would be the ones on the water molecules. Thus, partially positive hydrogens would form the weak hydrogen bonds with the chloride, and that's what would bring chloride into solution. So let me wrap it up with this. Look at this. Polar molecules stick to water, so polar molecules dissolve in water. Cations, positively charged ions, dissolve in water too because they stick to water. Anions, negatively charged ions, they dissolve in water too because they stick to water. All right? So what kinds of molecules, if I were to ask you, what kinds of molecules dissolve in water and are hydrophilic? That's right, any kind of polar molecules and ions, ionic compounds, right? Ions and polar molecules dissolve in water. So next, I'm going to explain why fats and oils don't dissolve in water. Let's do that next. All right, now I'm going to draw a molecule on the board, and I want you to try to remember what this molecule is. So it's a carbon with 4 hydrogens attached. Do you remember this from chapter 2? This is known as CH4 or methane. Now let me ask you this. If water were to come by, like a little water friend, right? A little water molecule. Remember that water is a polar molecule, meaning it has a partial negative charge on the oxygen and it has partial positive charges on the hydrogens, right? Now let me ask you this, okay? I showed you how water interacts with ammonia and with sodium cation and chloride anion. Now, how would the water molecule interact with methane? Let me ask you this. Is methane a polar molecule with partial charges, or is it nonpolar? Well, if you remember from chapter 2, and this was a big important point from chapter 2, if you remember from chapter 2, carbon and hydrogen have roughly the same electronegativity. This means that when they share these electrons in the covalent bond, they share the electrons evenly. And anytime you share electrons evenly in a covalent bond, that forms a nonpolar covalent bond, and partial charges do not form, right? So let me ask you this. Is there a partial positive charge on the hydrogen, or is there a partial negative charge on a hydrogen? Is there any kind of partial charges on a methane? The answer is no. There's no kind of charge at all. There's no charges at all. There's no partial positive. There's no partial negative. There's no full positive or full negative. There's just no charge whatsoever on methane because it's a nonpolar molecule. So now let me ask you this. Do you remember how water stuck to the other molecules we just talked about? Well, the hydrogens have a slight positive charge, right? So what do the hydrogens want to stick to? They want to stick to anything negative, anything negative. Does methane have any negative part? No. What about the oxygen of water? Look at the oxygen of water. It's partially negative. That means it'll stick to anything with a positive charge. A partial positive charge, a full positive charge, it doesn't care. As long as it's a positive charge, the oxygen will stick to it, right? Does methane have a partial positive or a full positive charge anywhere? Does it have any kind of charge anywhere? The answer is no, right? So let me ask you this. What part of water would want to stick to methane? Trick question, right? No part, right? The hydrogens are looking for something negative to bind to. The oxygen is looking for something positive to bind to. And remember what I said just a little bit ago? If water can't stick to a molecule, water can't dissolve that molecule. Does that make sense? So again, water can't stick to methane because methane's nonpolar. It has nonpolar covalent bonds. And so there's no charges and there's nothing for water to stick to. And if water can't stick to you, water can't dissolve you. Isn't that neat? Now let me tell you this. What substances do you know of that water cannot dissolve, that separate? Well, how about water and oil, right? Oil. How about water and fats, like butter and things like this? Oil's a type of fat, but oil, other fats, most of the lipids, waxes, okay? Well, think about this. Think about this. Oil, fat, lipid, wax. These substances do not bind to water. They do not dissolve in water. And what do you think these have in common? What property do you think these have that prevents them from mixing in water and being dissolved in water? Well, they are just like methane. They are nonpolar molecules. They don't have charges, right? And because they don't have any charges, water doesn't know how to stick to them. And so they separate like oil and water. Isn't that neat? And by the way, before I let you go to the next concept, these fats and oils are known, these waxes, these lipids are known for being big old molecules made almost entirely of carbon and hydrogen. Isn't that neat? So oils, fats, waxes, these are just big molecules made almost entirely of carbon and hydrogen. And remember, when you have carbon and hydrogen in a molecule, those bonds are nonpolar bonds. So that's most likely going to be a nonpolar molecule. Isn't that neat? So now you understand, hopefully, at the molecular level, exactly why water is a good solvent for polar and ionic compounds and molecules, but it is not a good solvent for nonpolar, hydrophobic fats, oils, lipids, wax. Isn't that neat? So let's move back to the computer for more lecturing. So welcome back from the board. Now, most chemical reactions in organisms involve solutes dissolved in water because remember, life occurs in an aqueous environment. The cell is full of water. When carrying out experiments, we use mass to calculate the number of solute molecules in an aqueous solution. So here's some terminology we need to understand and some values we need to learn with regard to how we calculate concentration of solute. First of all, let's learn this term molecular mass. Molecular mass is the sum of all masses of all atoms in a molecule. Next, numbers of molecules are usually measured in moles. You may have heard of Avogadro's number, where 1 mole, also known as a MOL mole, is equal to 6.022 times 10 to the 23 molecules. So this is known as Avogadro's number, and Avogadro's number is the number of molecules in a mole. Okay. Avogadro's number and the unit Dalton were defined such that 6.022 times 10 to the 23 Daltons equals 1 gram. So that's kind of how the terms were defined. Now, molarity. Molarity, or capital M, is the number of moles of solute per liter of solution. Water is needed, it's necessary for life. Biologists seeking life on other planets have concentrated their search on planets that might have water. Why? Because water is indispensable to life. Water is necessary for life. And so the first thing we look for when we look at other planets is for sources of water. In fact, India has just recently landed a rover on the moon, and one of its key missions is to really search for any possible water on the moon. That would be such a cool finding. More than 800 planets have been found outside of our solar system, And there's evidence that a few of them have water vapor. So this is very exciting because this would suggest that those planets might support life. In our solar system, Mars has been found to have water. And this is why, Elon Musk as well as others are so excited to go out and start trying to colonize Mars or start trying to determine whether life on Mars might be possible. Here you can see evidence for liquid water on Mars. These dark streaks are indicative, and the rovers that are up there are hard at work at trying to figure out just how much and where, and if these types of future endeavors are possible for man. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and take a necessary break time with Gizmo and Wicket and see what these little guys are up to, and we'll be right back to finish this chapter. All right, welcome back from break time with Gizmo and Wicket. Let's carry on with chapter 3. Next, we're going to touch on this concept of pH. And to do so, let's go over to the board again and learn what pH really means. All right, pay special attention and you will become a master of pH. pH, you've heard of pH before, right? You've heard of neutral, pH 7. You've heard of acidic pH or basic. Did you know another word for basic pH is alkaline pH? You've heard of these things, right? pH balanced, pH acidic, basic, neutral. But what exactly is pH and how does it work? So if you pay special attention for the next few minutes, you will understand pH at the molecular level and fully grasp what it really means. So let's get started. All right, to start my explanation of what pH really means, first I want you to understand what a hydrogen atom is, because that's really important that you understand hydrogen atoms, because it's fundamental to understanding how pH works. So let me explain what hydrogen is first, and then we'll go more into what is pH, okay? So remember that hydrogen is a proton. It's a proton, which means a positive charged subatomic particle, with an electron, a negatively charged subatomic particle. Remember that hydrogen, its atomic number is 1 and its mass number is also 1. So how many neutrons does hydrogen have? 0, right? Hydrogen has 0 neutrons. Hydrogen is simply a proton hanging out with an electron. All right, so I really need you to understand that hydrogen is a proton with an electron, and it's neutral because the proton and the electron cancel each other out in charge, overall net charge, right? And so if I were to ask you, what is a hydrogen atom made of, you would say what? You would say the hydrogen is made of a proton, right? Proton and an electron. That's it. That's all hydrogen is. And do you know what another word for a proton is? So let me show you this. Look at this. This is hydrogen atom, right? Hydrogen atom is a proton and an electron. What happens if hydrogen atom loses its electron? Well, now it's called hydrogen ion. ion. It's a cation. It's a positively charged hydrogen. And so another way of drawing that is H plus. All right, so again, when you see H plus in your textbook, I want you to know this. What is an H plus? What is H plus? H plus is a proton. H plus is hydrogen ion. It just means a hydrogen that has lost its electron, right? So what I need you to know before I explain pH is anytime you see H plus, you think that's a proton, right? Because isn't that all H plus is? It's a proton, right? It's a hydrogen that has lost its electron. So now that you know what hydrogen and hydrogen ion mean and what is a proton, let me show you water again in detail. I want to explain water because that's also fundamental to understanding pH. Remember, water is an oxygen. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. And that oxygen is bound to 2 hydrogens, right? I'm going to draw the hydrogens in red. And notice that each hydrogen contributes 1 electron of its own to this covalent bond here, to these covalent bonds in water. So the red dot represents hydrogen's electron that's being shared, right? And the black dots represent oxygen's electrons. Now, this is a water molecule. And what you need to understand is that water has this ability to ionize. What does that mean? That means that in a solution of water, some of those water molecules have kind of broken apart. And the way they break apart is kind of interesting, and I want to show you how it works. Okay? The way the water molecules break apart is the hydrogen ends up leaving the water molecule. The hydrogen leaves. But let me tell you this. The hydrogen leaves the water molecule, but it leaves its electron behind. It leaves its electron behind. So let me ask you that. If the hydrogen left and brought its electron, it would be called hydrogen. But what do you think it's called when the hydrogen leaves the water molecule and leaves its only electron behind? What is this? Remember, a hydrogen is simply a proton and an electron. However, when this hydrogen leaves the water molecule, it leaves its electron behind. So this is simply what? This is H plus. This is a proton. Okay, this is a proton. So what has happened to the water molecule? A proton has left the water molecule. This is known as ionization. And what happens is you're left with this, see? Now you're left with an oxygen and a hydrogen, and look, this oxygen has an extra electron. So this is known as OH minus, or hydroxide ion. Hydroxide ion. Hydroxide anion. And what popped off? A proton. A proton, or a hydrogen ion. A hydrogen cation. So water, H2O, can ionize into what? Water can ionize into hydroxide ion and a proton, a hydrogen ion. All right, so let me explain the next step. Water molecules can ionize, which means a proton can leave the water molecule, resulting in a hydroxide ion and the proton that left. Now, I want to explain how this works. This is a liter bottle of water, right? It's my Nalgene liter bottle. And in this bottle are roughly 56 moles of water. Now, let me write that down for you. In this water molecule are approximately 56 mole of H2O, of water molecules. That's how many water molecules are in a liter of water. Now you might be asking, Dr. D, how many of those water molecules have broken apart, have ionized, have had the proton pop off to result in this? Well, very, very few of the 56 moles of water have ionized. Just how few? Let me explain. In this bottle, okay, if this is pure water, if this is drinking water, pure water, then in this bottle of water, there's 56 moles of water, but only this many, 0.0000001. Yep, just double checking. Only that many moles have broken apart. And so there is only that many protons in the solution. Isn't that interesting? So very few of these 56 moles of water molecules have ionized. And why is that important? Well, it's because that proton concentration of the water is the definition of pH, right? So pH refers to how concentrated are the protons in the solution. And do you know that drinking water, like I just showed you, is pH 7? You probably know that drinking water is pH 7, but you may not understand why, right? Well, it's simply because it refers to the concentration of protons in the solution. So look at this. 0.0000001 moles of protons is the same thing as 10 to the minus 7 moles of proton. And pH simply is the minus log of 10 to the minus 7, which is 7. So the reason why, isn't this neat? The reason why drinking water is called pH 7 water is because out of the 56 moles of water in this liter, 10 to the minus 7 are protons. There's 10 to the minus 7 protons in a liter of water, and that's why that's pH 7. Isn't that neat? Now, something else you may know about drinking water is that it's called neutral pH. So what does that mean? Why is pH 7 called neutral pH? Well, let me explain why. Remember, water breaks apart into hydroxide ion and protons. And I told you that my drinking water has 10 to the minus 7 concentration of protons, right? 10 to the minus 7 concentration of protons. Well, guess what? What does neutral mean? Do you guys remember? Neutral refers to, for every plus charge, you should have a negative charge to cancel it out. So, protons are plus charge. I have 10 to the minus 7 protons. So how many hydroxide ions would I need to cancel that out completely? That's right, I would need 10 to the minus 7 hydroxide ions. So did you see that? Neutral pH is neutral because that's the only pH level where the concentration of protons equals the concentration of hydroxide ions. So in my liter of water here, I have 56 moles of water, but I have 10 to the minus 7 moles of protons in here floating around, and I have an equal amount. I have 10 to the minus 7 moles of hydroxide ions floating around in here too. That's why it's neutral. Only at pH 7 do I have the same exact amount of both the hydroxide ions, which are negatively charged, and the protons, which are positively charged. And that's why it's called neutral. The pluses cancel out the minuses, and this is neutral drinking water to enjoy. All right, so again, at pH 7, the hydrogen ion concentration, also known as the proton concentration, is what in my liter of water? Remember, it is 10 to the minus 7 moles. 10 to the minus 7, okay? And in this case, what would be pH 6? What's the difference between pH 5 and pH 6? Well, did you know that if I have a solution that's pH 6, that means instead of having 10 to the minus 7 moles of protons in that solution, I have 10 times more. So look, instead of having 0.000001, instead of having 10 to the minus 7 moles of protons, at pH 6, I actually have one fewer zero, right? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 10 to the minus 6 protons, moles of protons in my solution. So you see, I have 10 times more protons at pH 6 than I did at pH 7. And at pH 5, what do you think there is? It's another 10 times more. I have 10 times more protons at pH 5. So at pH 5, look, at pH 5, this is how many moles of protons I have in the solution. Every time I go lower in pH, I multiply the amount of protons times 10. That's called an order of magnitude more. So what would be the concentration of protons at pH 4? That's right, it would be 10 to the minus 4. And what would be my protons at pH 3? It would be 10 to the minus 3. And at pH 2, it would be 10 to the minus 2. And at pH 1, it would be 10 to the minus 1. And at pH 0, it would be 10 to the 0. Okay, it's 10 to the 0. And what is 10 to the 0? What is 10 to the 0? 10 to the 0 equals 1, right? So at pH 0, I have 1 mole of protons in my 56 moles of water. Isn't that neat? So, by the way, as we go this direction from, this is neutral pH, as we go down in pH towards 0, this is more acidic. More acidic. So pH 0 would be super strong acid, right? pH 7 is neutral, pH 0 is strongly acidic. And you see how it works? Every time you go down from pH 7 to 6, that's 10 times more protons. Then from 6 to 5, that's 10 times more, 10 times more, 10 times more, 10 times more. So a strong acid has a very high concentration of protons compared to neutral water. Now, what if we're going the other direction, right? What if we're going towards base, right? that means that the pH is going higher. The pH is going to pH 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and it can go up to 14, right? So at pH 8, what's happening to your proton concentration, do you think? That's right, it's decreasing by 10. So look at this. At pH 8, you have 10 to the minus 8 protons. You have 8 times fewer protons than you did at pH 7. And pH 9, you have 10 times fewer again. So you see, as we get more basic or alkaline, right? This is called more basic, also known as more alkaline. We're getting fewer and fewer protons. The protons are decreasing by 10x every step. The protons decrease by 10x every single step. So what that should tell you is that a very strong base, like a pH 14 base, has very, very, very few protons. There are very few protons in a pH 14 solution. However, there's an entire mole of protons in a pH 0 solution. Isn't that neat? So that is what pH means. It's the concentration of protons in the solution. All right? Now, what does it mean when we talk about neutral pH? What's happening with the hydroxide ions? That's the last step to really understanding how pH works. So let's explain that next. We know how protons work in pH solutions, but what about the hydroxide ions? Do you guys remember the hydroxide ion? Also known as, the OH minus concentration. At what pH does the proton concentration equal the hydroxide ion concentration? That's right, neutral pH. So at pH 7, which is neutral pH, how many moles of protons do you have? 10 to the minus 7 in your 56 moles total. So how many moles of hydroxide ions would you have at pH 7? That's right, exactly the same amount, right? 10 to the minus 7. But recall, only at pH 7 do you have the same concentration of protons as you do hydroxide ions. So what happens at pH 6? Look at this. At pH 6, the proton concentration went up by 10. Well, guess what? The protons and the hydroxide ions are what's called inversely proportional. You know what that means, that term inversely proportional? That means as one goes up by 10, the other goes down by the same amount, by 10, right? So what's happening at pH 6? If the protons went up in concentration by 10, what would the hydroxide ion be doing? It's going the opposite direction by the same amount. It's going down by 10. So I've decreased my hydroxide ion concentration by 10, but I've increased my proton concentration by 10. So as one goes up by 10, the other goes down by 10. Isn't that neat? So what about here at pH 5? My protons went up by another 10, so my hydroxide ions should go down by another 10, right? So 10 to the minus 9, and then it would be 10 to the minus 10. You see, so as we get more acidic, the proton concentration keeps jumping by 10, but the hydroxide ion concentration keeps decreasing by 10. Isn't that neat? So let me finish writing this out for you. So check it out. As we went to more acidic, the proton concentration increased dramatically, but the hydroxide ion concentration drops significantly down to 10 to the minus 14. That's a tiny concentration of hydroxide ions while you have an entire mole of protons at pH 0. So a very strong acid, let me show you this. If this held a very strong acid, if this wasn't drinking water, if this was a super strong acid, it would have a pH 0, it would have 1 mole out of 56 moles. It would have 1 mole of protons, but only 10 to the minus 14, a tiny amount of hydroxide ions. And that is what an acid is. An acid has a lot more protons than it does hydroxide ions. And remember, only at pH 7 does it have the same amount of both. Isn't that neat to understand? And so what is a strong base? When we're going towards more basic, what's happening to your proton concentration? That's right, it keeps dropping by 10. See, the proton concentration's dropping by 10. But what's happening to your hydroxide ion concentration? That's right, it's increasing by 10. Isn't that neat? Look at this. Oh, I'm sorry. Look at this. I'm going to finish writing this out for you. Now check it out. So did you see what happened here? It's the opposite of the acidity. When we get more basic, your proton concentration drops to 10 to the minus 14. You've got a tiny, tiny amount of protons, but what do you have? You have 10 to the 0, or 1 mole of hydroxide ions. Isn't that neat? So if this was a super strong base in here, this was super basic, it was basic like pH 14 base in here, well, guess what? That would mean that out of my 56 moles of water, I'd have 1 mole of hydroxide ion and only a tiny bit, only 10 to the minus 14 mole of protons. Isn't that cool? So now you fully understand, I hope you understood, that this is awesome, right? Now you get it at the molecular level exactly how pH works. And now you don't have to guess what pH is. It doesn't have to be a mystery. I hope you understand, and it's fun to understand this kind of stuff. It's fun to understand science, understand what exactly is pH. All right, I hope that was informative. So let's come back to our slides. And again, remember that water breaks apart. The hydrogen atom leaves its electron behind and is transferred as a proton. Remember, a hydrogen ion, or H+, pops off from the water molecule. The water molecule has lost the proton and is now the hydroxide ion. Remember, OH-. And you can see here that water is in a dynamic state, a dynamic equilibrium in which water molecules dissociate, so ionize, at the same rate at which they are being reformed. And here you can see this is a balanced equation at equilibrium where water molecules ionize to form hydronium ion, H3O+, and hydroxide ion, OH-. This is your proton. This is your hydroxide ion. And remember, even though it's very few number of water molecules that dissociate like this, it still has a great effect on organisms because protons and hydroxide ions are very reactive, and changes in their concentrations can drastically affect the chemistry of a cell. Right? Remember, when you change the concentrations of protons and hydroxide ions, you're changing the pH, right? Concentrations of protons and hydroxide ions are equal in pure water. That's why it's called neutral pH. Adding certain solutes called acids and bases can modify the concentration of protons and hydroxide ions. Biologists use the pH scale to describe whether a solution is acidic or basic. An acid is a substance that increases the proton concentration of a solution. So if you add something to water, let's say you add a chemical to water and that chemical releases protons into the water, that's an acid. because the more protons there are, the more acidic the solution is. Conversely, a base is something that reduces the number of protons in the solution. And by reducing the number of protons, that you are making it less acidic and more basic. Strong acids and bases dissociate completely in water, whereas weak acids and bases reversibly release and accept back the ions. In many aqueous solutions at 25 degrees C, the product of protons and hydroxide ions is constant and written in this fashion: the concentration of protons times the concentration of hydroxide ions has to equal 10 to the minus 14. And remember, at equilibrium, you have 10 to the minus 7 protons, and you have 10 to the minus 7 hydroxide ions. So 10 to the minus 7 times 10 to the minus 7 is 10 to the minus 14. But at pH 6, what would it be, right? At pH 6, it would be 10 to the minus 6 protons, and hydroxide ions would be, that's right, 10 to the minus 8, because as one goes up by 10, the other goes down by 10. They're inversely proportional. And by the way, what about pH 0? How would pH 0 work? At pH 0, the proton concentration would be 10 to the 0, or 1, right? 1 mole of protons. And the hydroxide ion concentration would be 10 to the minus 14. So 1 times 10 to the minus 14 would be 10 to the minus 14. You would have 1 mole of protons in your 56 moles of water in a liter. That's how many protons would be in the strongest acid in the world. Conversely, the strongest base in the world, right? pH 14, it would be the converse, right? The hydroxide ions would be 10 to the 0, or 1 mole, and the protons would be at 10 to the minus 14 moles. And again, 10 to the minus 14 times 1 would be 10 to the minus 14. So isn't that interesting? At pH 0, you have 1 mole out of 56 moles in a liter of protons. At pH 14, you have 1 mole out of 56 total moles in 1 liter of hydroxide ions. Isn't that neat to understand? And remember, to calculate pH is the pH of a solution is defined by the negative log of the proton concentration, written as pH equals minus log of the proton concentration. Again, so for example, if we're talking about a neutral solution of pure water, the proton concentration or the hydrogen ion concentration is 10 to the minus 7. So you plug 10 to the minus 7 in here in the brackets, and the minus log of 10 to the minus 7 is 7. And that is where we get this term pH 7. pH 7 is the minus log of the concentration of protons in a liter of water. So again, acidic solutions have a pH value less than 7. Basic solutions have a pH value greater than 7. And most biological fluids have pH values in the range of about 6 to 8. So this is known as physiological pH. Here's some examples of pH differences in different common household goods and different kinds of solutions that you might come into contact with. Remember, at pH 7, we have pure water. A little bit more basic would be human blood and tears. Then at about pH 8, we have seawater and the insides of our small intestine. At around pH 10, we have milk of magnesia. At pH 11, we have household ammonia. So ammonia is quite basic. At pH 12, we have a household bleach. And at pH 13, we have oven cleaner. And remember, these solutions that have a higher pH are bases. They're alkaline. Another term for base is alkaline, by the way. Base and alkaline mean the same thing. And here you can see the basic solution. The basic solution has far more hydroxide ions than it does protons, right? Hydrogen ions. But at the neutral pH, the proton concentration is equal to the hydroxide ion concentration. Conversely, as we go lower in pH, right, we have urine, saliva. Then at pH 5, we have black coffee, rainwater. At pH 4, we have tomato juice and beer. At pH 3, vinegar, wine, cola, formic acid from ants. At pH 2, we have gastric juice in your stomach, lemon juice. And at pH 1, we would have battery acid. And remember, these are low in the pH scale, so it's increasingly acidic, where we have more protons in the solution than we have hydroxide ions. Now, what are buffers? Buffers are substances that minimize changes in pH. They minimize changes in the concentration of protons and hydroxide ions. Why? Because they contain a weak acid and its weak corresponding base. So here we have an example of a buffer with an acid and its corresponding base. In response to a rise in pH, the acid will release a proton. And in response to a drop in pH, the base will accept a proton. So what you need to know about buffers is that buffers maintain a pH range. So if you want to maintain a certain pH of a solution, you typically add a buffer to it, and the buffer keeps the solution within a particular pH range. Acidification is a threat to our oceans today. Human activities such as burning of fossil fuels threatens our water quality. Why? Because CO2 that's released from burning of these fuels is the main product of fossil fuel combustion. So when you run your car, when you burn things, you're releasing CO2, the greenhouse gas, into the environment. And in addition to climate change, there is also other repercussions for this CO2 in the environment. About 25% of human-generated CO2 is absorbed by the oceans. So the CO2 gets into the ocean. That CO2 dissolves in the seawater and forms an acid called carbonic acid. Again, CO2 plus water equals an acid, carbonic acid. This process is called ocean acidification. So you could see kind of how it plays out here. We burn fossil fuels and release CO2 into the environment. The CO2 gets soaked up into the ocean like a sponge. And when that happens, CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then releases a proton. That's why it's an acid, right? Acids release protons into the solution, making the solution more acidic. So now you have more protons in the environment. But here's the problem. I just want to show you something at the bottom here. Carbonate, this molecule carbonate, is normally used in the oceans to combine with calcium to form calcium carbonate. This is a component of coral reefs and shells of mollusks, very important for coral reefs. And what happens when the protons are released into the ocean by carbonic acid is that the protons react with carbonate, and that produces this bicarbonate, and it depletes the carbonate. And you might be wondering, well, why is that bad? Well, because without carbonate, we can't produce calcium carbonate, and we can't produce shells for the coral reef, for the mollusks, for the shellfish, for the different types of clams. And so the reefs are getting depleted. So again, as seawater acidifies, proton ions combine with carbonate ions to produce bicarbonate ions. Carbonate is required for calcification or production of calcium carbonate by many marine organisms, including reef builders. And researchers believe that ocean acidification is likely to cause profound ecosystem-wide changes in the coral reefs, another great reason to reduce emissions of these gases. Now, there may be reason for optimism about the future quality of our water resources. We have made progress in learning about the delicate chemical balances in the oceans, lakes, and rivers, and continued progress can come from the actions of informed individuals who are concerned about environmental quality. Awesome, you guys. Well, I hope you learned a lot about water. We touched on very important aspects of water that contribute to life on Earth. And now you understand why the first thing we look at on other planets is the presence of water to see if we can live on those planets. I hope this was informative. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment box below, and I will catch you guys next time.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D.